Chapter 18. The boy lay, trembling a little, beneath the bedclothes. The screwdriver was under his mattress. He had heard the alarm clock. He had heard Mrs. Driver exclaim on the stairs, and he had run. The candle on the table beside his bed still smelt a little, and the wax must still be warm. He lay there waiting, but they did not come upstairs. After hours, it seemed, he heard the hall clock strike 1. All seemed quiet below, and at last he slipped out of bed and crept along the passage to the head of the stairway. There he sat for a while, shivering a little and gazing downwards into the darkened hall. There was no sound but the steady tick of the clock, and occasionally that shuffle or whisper which might be wind, but which, as he knew, was the sound of the house itself. The sigh of the tired floors and the ache of the knotted wood. So quiet it was that at last he found courage to move to tiptoe down the staircase and along the kitchen passage. He listened a while outside the baize door, and at length, very gently, he pushed it open. The kitchen was silent and filled with grayish darkness. He felt, as Mrs. Driver had done, along the shelf for the matches, and he struck a light. He saw the gaping hole in the floor and the objects piled beside it, and in the same flash he saw a candle on the shelf. He lit it clumsily, with trembling hands. Yes, there they lay, the contents of the little home, higgledy-piggledy on the board, and the tongs lay beside them. Mrs. Driver had carried away all she considered valuable and had left the rubbish. And rubbish it looked like, thrown down like this: balls of wood, old potatoes, odd pieces of doll furniture, matchboxes, cotton spools, crumpled squares of blotting paper. He knelt down. The house itself was in shambles. Partitions fallen, earth floors revealed where Pod had dug down to give greater height to the rooms. Matchsticks, an old cogwheel, onion skins, scattered bottle tops. The boy stared, blinking his eyelids and tilting the candle so that the grease ran hot on his hand. Then he got up from his knees. Crossing the kitchen on tiptoe, he closed the scullery door. He came back to the hole, and leaning down, he called softly, "Arrietty, Arrietty." After a little while, he called again. Something else fell hot on his hand. It was a tear from his eye. Angrily, he brushed it away, and leaning further into the hole, he called once more. "Pod?" he whispered. "Homily." They appeared so quietly that at first, in the wavering light of the candle, he did not see them. Silently they stood, looking up at him with scared white faces from what had been the passage outside the storerooms. "Where have you been?" asked the boy. Pod cleared his throat. "Up the end of the passage, under the clock." "I've got to get you out," said the boy. "Where to?" asked Pod. "I don't know. What about the attic?" "That ain't no good," said Pod. "I heard them talking. They're going to get the police and a cat and the sanitary inspector and the rat catcher from the town hall at Leighton Buzzard." They were all silent. Little eyes stared at big eyes. "There won't be nowhere in the house that's safe," Pod said at last, and no one moved. "What about the doll's house at the top shelf of the schoolroom?" suggested the boy. "Even a cat can't get there." Homily gave a little moan of assent. "Yes," she said, "the doll's house." "No," said Pod in the same expressionless voice. "You can't live on a shelf. Maybe the cat can't get up, but no more can't you get down. You're stuck. You got to have water." "I'd bring you water," said the boy, "and there are beds and things here." He touched a pile of rubbish. "No," said Pod, "a shelf ain't no good. Besides, you'll be going soon, or so they say." "Oh, Pod," pleaded Homily in a husky whisper, "there's stairs in the doll's house, and 2 bedrooms, and a dining room and kitchen and a bathroom," she said. "But it's up by the ceiling," Pod explained wearily. "You got to eat, haven't you? And drink?" "Yes, Pod, I know, but—" "There ain't no buts," said Pod. He drew a long breath. "We got to immigrate," he said. "Oh," moaned Homily softly, and Arrietty began to cry. "Now don't take on," said Pod in a tired voice. Arrietty had covered her face with her hands, and her tears ran down her fingers. The boy, watching, saw them glisten in the candlelight. "I'm not taking on," she gasped. "I'm happy. I'm so happy." "You mean," said the boy to Pod, but with one eye on Arrietty, "you'll go to the Badgers set?" He too felt mounting excitement. "Where else?" asked Pod. "Oh, my goodness gracious," moaned Homily, and sat down on the broken matchbox chest of drawers. "But you've got to go somewhere tonight," said the boy. "You've got to go somewhere before tomorrow morning." "Oh, my goodness gracious," moaned Homily again. "He's right at that," said Pod. "Can't cross them fields in the dark. Bad enough getting across them in daylight." I know, cried Arrietty. Her wet face glistened in the candlelight. It was light and tremendous, and she raised her arms a little as though about to fly, and she swayed as she balanced on her tiptoes. Let's go to the doll's house just for tonight, and tomorrow, she closed her eyes against the brightness of the vision, tomorrow the boy will take us. Take us, she could not say to where. Take us, cried Homily in a strange, hollow voice. How? In his pockets, chanted Arrietty, won't you? Again, she swayed with light upturned face. Yes, he said, and bring the luggage up after in a fish basket. Oh my goodness, moaned Homily. I'll pick all the furniture out of this pile here, or most of it, they'll hardly notice, and anything you want. Tea, murmured Homily, enough for our lifetimes. All right, said the boy, I'll get a pound of tea, and coffee too if you like, and cooking pots, and matches. You'll be all right, he said. But what do they eat? Wailed Homily. Caterpillars? Now, Homily, said Pod, don't be foolish. Loopy was always a good manager. But Loopy isn't there, said Homily. Berries. Do they eat berries? How do they cook? Out of doors? Now, Homily, said Pod, we'll see them all when we get there. I couldn't light a fire of sticks, said Homily. Not in the wind. What if it rains? She asked, how do they cook in the rain? Now, Homily, began Pod. He was beginning to lose patience, but Homily rushed on. Could you get us a couple tins of sardines to take? She asked the boy, and some salt, and some candles, and matches. And could you bring us the carpets from the doll's house? Yes, said the boy. I could. Of course I could. Anything you want. All right, said Homily. She still looked wild, partly because some of her hair had rollers out of the curlers, but she seemed appeased. How are you going to get us upstairs, up to the schoolroom? The boy looked down at his pocketless nightshirt. I'll carry you, he said. How? Asked Homily. In your hands? Yes, said the boy. I'd rather die, said Homily. I'd rather stay right here and be eaten by the rat catcher from the town hall at Light and Buzzard. The boy looked around the kitchen. He seemed bewildered. Shall I carry you in the clothespins bag? He asked at last, seeing it hanging in its usual place on the handle of the scullery door. All right, said Homily. Take out the clothespins first. But she walked into it bravely enough when he laid it down on the floor. It was soft and floppy and made of woven raffia. When he picked it up, Homily shrieked and clung to Pod and Arrietty. Oh, she gasped as the bag swayed a little. Oh, I can't. Stop it. Put me down. Oh. And clutching and slipping, they fell into a tangle at the bottom. Be quiet, Homily, can't you? Exclaimed Pod angrily and held her tightly by the ankle. It was not easy to control her as he was lying on his back with his face pushed forward on his chest and one leg held upright by the side of the bag. Somewhere above his head, Arrietty climbed up, away from them, clinging to the knots of raffia, and looked out over the edge. Oh, I can't, cried Homily. Stop it, Pod, I'm dying. Tell him to put us down. Put us down, said Pod in his patient way. Just for a moment. That's right, on the floor. And once as the bag was placed beside the hole, they all ran out. Look here, said the boy unhappily to Homily. You've got to try. She'll try, all right, said Pod. Give her a breather, and just take it slower, if you see what I mean. All right, agreed the boy, but there isn't much time. Come on, he said nervously. Hop in. Listen, cried Pod sharply, and froze. The boy, looking down, saw their three upturned faces catching the light. Like pebbles they looked, still and stony, against the darkness within the hole. And then, in a flash, they were gone. The boards were empty, and the hole was bare. He leaned into it. Pod, he called in a frantic whisper. Homily, come back. And then he too became frozen, stopped, and rigid above the hole. The scullery door creaked open behind them. It was Mrs. Driver. She stood there, silent, this time in her nightdress. Turning, the boy stared up at her. Hello, he said uncertainly after a moment. She did not smile, but something lighted in her eyes, a malicious gleam, a look of triumph. She carried a candle which shone upwards on her face, streaking it strangely with light and shadow. What are you doing down here? She asked. He stared at her, but he did not speak. Answer me, she said. What are you doing with the clothespins bag? Still, he stared at her, almost stupidly. The clothespins bag? He repeated and looked down as though surprised to see it in his hand. Nothing, he said. Was it you who put the watch in that hole? No, he said, staring up at her. It was there already. Ah, she said and smiled. So you knew it was there? No, he said. I mean, yes. Do you know what you are? Asked Mrs. Driver, watching him closely. You're a sneaking, thieving, noxious little dribbit of no good. His face quivered. Why? He said. You know why. You're a wicked, black-hearted, fibbing little pickpocket. That's what you are. And so are they. They're nasty little, crafty, scampy, scurvy, squeaking little... No, they're not, he put in quickly. So you're in league with them. She came across to him and, taking him by the upper arm, she jerked him to his feet. You know what they do with thieves? She asked. No, he said. They lock them up. That's what they do with thieves, and that's what's going to happen to you. I'm not a thief, cried the little boy, his lips trembling. I'm a borrower. A what? She swung him around and tightening the grip on his arm. A borrower, he repeated. There were tears on his eyelids. He hoped they would not fall. So that's what you call it, she exclaimed, as he had done not so long, it seems now, that day with Arrietty. That's their name, he said, the kind of people they are. They're borrowers. Borrowers, eh? Repeated Mrs. Driver wonderingly. She laughed. Well, they've done all the borrowing they're ever going to do in this house. She began to drag him toward the door. The tears spilled over his eyelids and ran down his cheeks. Don't hurt them, he begged. I'll move them, I promise. I know how. Mrs. Driver laughed again and pushed him roughly through the green baize door. They'll be moved all right, she said. Don't worry. The rat catcher will know how. Cranford's old cat will know how. So will the sanitary inspector and the fire brigade, if need be. The police will know how, I shouldn't wonder. No need to worry about moving them. Once you've found the nest, she went on, dropping her voice to a vicious whisper as they paused past Aunt Sophie's door. The rest is easy. She pushed him into the schoolroom and locked the door, and he heard the boards of the passage creak beneath her tread as, satisfied, she moved away. He crept into bed then, because he was cold, and cried his heart out under the blankets.